Okay, well, today we are going to finish up the rest of the material that will be included on our first exam, which is coming up on Monday. So Friday will just be review. I'm not planning on covering any new material Friday, but we will have class. We'll do some review though, okay? Remember also that Monday at 1 p.m. is the deadline for getting your Connect assignments done, okay? How many of you have finished more than one of the Connect assignments? Okay, good. Was the second and third one a little shorter? Yeah, I don't think there was many questions on those. So those shouldn't take too long, but don't put it off until Sunday night, okay? Or even worse, don't put it off until Monday, because you may run out of time if you do that, okay? So today we're gonna go over part of chapter 17 on the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. The reason we're going over these two together is because they actually work together to release hormones that regulate other endocrine glands. Okay? So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at the anatomical relationships between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, because the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland send signals back and forth to each other to make sure that the proper amounts of hormones are released. Also, we're going to take a quick look at the embryological development of the pituitary, which I think is interesting because there's actually two parts to the pituitary gland. There's an anterior pituitary and a posterior pituitary. And they really act just like two separate glands. They secrete different hormones. They actually are completely separated. The reason for that is that they develop from two different parts of the embryo. So it's not surprising that they secrete different hormones and act just like two separate hormones. Also, we're going to take a look at the hormones released by the hypothalamus. I'm not going to expect that you remember the names of all the hormones released by the hypothalamus, but you just need to have a general knowledge of how they work and how they stimulate the pituitary. And then we're going to take a look at how the pituitary hormones are released and what some of the functions of those hormones. You're going to need to know the names as well as the function of the pituitary hormones, of which there are 8. There are 8 major hormones produced by the pituitary gland. And that's both the anterior and the pituitary, or anterior and posterior pituitary. Okay, so this is actually two diagrams of the hypothalamus up here and the pituitary down here. Okay, the hypothalamus, remember, is actually composed of the floor of the diencephalon. So the hypothalamus is actually part of the brain. So it's called a neuroendocrine organ or neuroendocrine structure because it has functions in both the nervous system as well as the endocrine system. Okay? Pituitary is down here. And on the anterior side of the pituitary you have, or of the pituitary gland, you have the anterior pituitary, and then you have the posterior pituitary. They're derived from different embryological tissues, and they communicate with the hypothalamus by different mechanisms, and they secrete different hormones. So the pituitary is really 2 glands in one. It really should be considered 2 separate glands. Okay? So we'll come back and talk about how these 2 parts of the pituitary communicate with the hypothalamus a little bit later. But first, let's take a look at the development. So the pituitary gland develops very early on in development, towards the end of the first month of development after fertilization. And there are two embryological structures which eventually become fused to form the pituitary. The first one is right here. So this kind of light brown or tan shaded area right here, this is the developing brain of the embryo. And remember, the brain develops from expansions of the cranial portion of the neural tube, okay? And so at about 4 weeks after fertilization, there's a little outpocketing that forms in the floor of the diencephalon. And that little outpocketing right there, that little pouch that pooches out, is called the infundibulum, okay? Which is kind of confusing because that's also a part of, well, the infundibulum is also a name for the stalk that attaches the pituitary to the hypothalamus. It also refers to a little outpocketing of the diencephalon of the embryo. Then the other embryological structure that contributes to the pituitary is an outpocketing of the roof of the pharynx. Pharynx is the throat region, okay? So this is the mouth of the embryo right here. And then if you go inside the mouth, you have the oral cavity, and then this area right here is the pharynx. There's a little outpocketing of the roof of the pharynx. And embryologists refer to that outpocketing of the roof of the digestive tract as Rathke's pouch. That's the most commonly named for it by embryologists. Okay. So eventually, Rathke's pouch loses its attachment to the pharynx. That stalk that joins the pharynx to Rathke's pouch just kind of disintegrates. And then Rathke's pouch fuses with the infundibulum to form the pituitary. So by 16 weeks, you end up with the anterior and posterior pituitary attached to the hypothalamus by a stalk. That stalk is also known as the infundibulum, okay, because it's derived from that outpocketing that's called the infundibulum, right? So this Rathke's pouch right here, that's what develops into the anterior pituitary. And the infundibulum, which is an outpocketing of the brain, that develops into the posterior pituitary. Okay? Now, consequently, since the posterior pituitary develops from the outpocketing of the brain, another name for the posterior pituitary is the neurohypophysis. Okay? And I think that's shown, okay, let me skip ahead here. Okay. So this portion right here, the posterior pituitary, that's also known as a neurohypophysis. The reason for that is it develops from part of the nervous system. And hypophysis is another name for pituitary. Okay. The anterior pituitary, on the other hand, is called the adenohypophysis, okay, or the adenohypophysis. So the anterior pituitary is the adenohypophysis, and posterior is the neurohypophysis. Okay, let's go back again. Okay, so as it turns out, the hypothalamus is really the master gland of the body. Because the hypothalamus produces neuropeptides that stimulate the release of the hormones from the anterior and posterior pituitary. At one time, biologists said that the pituitary is the master gland because it releases hormones that control all the other endocrine glands. But later on, they found out that it's actually the hypothalamus that causes those release of hormones from the pituitary. So really, if there's going to be a master gland, if you want to call it that, it would have to be the hypothalamus. Okay. So there's two different kinds of hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus. Most of them are called releasing hormones because they cause the pituitary to release their hormones. Okay? In addition, there's also inhibiting hormones. The inhibiting hormones are usually called statins. Okay? For example, there's an inhibiting hormone released by the pituitary that inhibits the release of growth hormone. That's called somatostatin. Okay? But most of them are called releasing hormones or releasing factors. All right? So, like I said, I'm not going to expect that you remember the names of all of the hormones produced by the hypothalamus. Just know that some of them are releasing hormones, some of them are inhibiting hormones called statins. So, for example, one of them is called thyrotropin-releasing hormone, or TRH. Thyrotropin-releasing hormone promotes the release of thyroid-stimulating hormone by the anterior pituitary. There's another one called corticotropin-releasing hormone. That stimulates the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone from the anterior pituitary. There's another one called gonadotropin-releasing hormone, or GnRH. GnRH stimulates the release of FSH and LH from the anterior pituitary. Those are two hormones involved in the regulation of reproduction in both males and females. Then there's another one that's released mainly in children, younger individuals, called growth hormone releasing hormone, or GHRH. That stimulates the release of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary. And then there are two inhibiting hormones. There's prolactin inhibiting hormone. Prolactin is a hormone that stimulates milk production. And that occurs mostly during pregnancy. So when a woman is not pregnant, then the hypothalamus releases prolactin inhibiting hormone. That inhibits the release of prolactin. Okay? And then finally, there's another inhibiting hormone called somatostatin. Somatostatin inhibits the release of growth hormone in adults. Okay? So some of them stimulate the release of hormones. Some of them inhibit the release of the pituitary hormones. Okay? So this is just a kind of a schematic diagram showing the kind of gives you an overall picture of the releasing hormones produced by the hypothalamus. Those travel down to the pituitary, and that stimulates the release of hormones that affect other endocrine glands, like the thyroid, the ovaries and testis, the adrenal cortex, affects the liver, and prolactin affects breast development during pregnancy. All right, now, there's actually two hormones that are released from the posterior pituitary, which actually are not produced by the posterior pituitary, but they're released from the posterior pituitary. And the reason for this is that the two hormones produced by the posterior pituitary, which are called oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin, those two hormones are synthesized in the hypothalamus, and they're transported to the posterior pituitary where they're released. So oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone are really hypothalamus hormones, but they're released from the posterior pituitary. So they're classified as posterior pituitary hormones because that's where they're released from. Right? Now, the way in which ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and also oxytocin are transported from the hypothalamus, where it's produced, to the posterior pituitary, which is down here on the right, is that there are nerve tracts that travel from the hypothalamus down. I'm sorry, it's up here. Here's the nerves. The nerve tracts travel from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary. So this is shown in the upper left. And ADH and oxytocin are produced in this part of the hypothalamus up here within cell bodies of neurons. Once those hormones are synthesized, they're then transported through the axons of those neurons down to the posterior pituitary. And that's where those hormones are released, is from the posterior pituitary. So really, the hypothalamus and posterior pituitary are working together to produce oxytocin and ADH. Okay, and so there's a band of nerve fibers that travel down through this infundibulum, which is the stalk between the hypothalamus and the pituitary, and that bundle of nerve fibers is called the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. Okay, because a tract refers to a bundle of nerve fibers. So the first part of this name, hypothalamo, that refers to the hypothalamus. Second part, hypophyseal. Hypophyseal refers to the hypophysis, which is the pituitary. Okay. So again, posterior pituitary hormones are synthesized by the hypothalamus, transported through nerve fibers down to the posterior pituitary where those hormones are released. Okay? Now, the mechanism of release of the anterior pituitary's hormones is very different, okay? Because the anterior pituitary hormones are released in response to releasing hormones produced by the hypothalamus. And both the hypothalamus as well as the anterior pituitary are very richly supplied with capillaries. So when the hypothalamus produces its releasing hormones and also statins that inhibit the release of hormones, those releasing hormones and statins diffuse into that capillary bed in the hypothalamus. Those capillaries in the hypothalamus are then drained into a portal vessel between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. This portal vessel is called the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal vein. And that travels through that stalk that connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary. Okay? And so those hormones diffuse into the capillary in the hypothalamus, and they travel down through this portal vein to the anterior pituitary. And that portal vein then divides up into another capillary bed in the anterior pituitary. And so those releasing hormones produced by the hypothalamus can diffuse out of those capillaries into the anterior pituitary. And that stimulates the release of the hormones by the anterior pituitary, which there are 6 main ones. There's a lot of hormones produced by the anterior pituitary. There's 6 of them. Okay. So this blood vessel or vein between the capillaries in the hypothalamus and the capillaries of the anterior pituitary is called a portal vein. A portal vein is a blood vessel that connects 2 capillary beds, just like the hepatic portal vein. Hepatic portal vein is a vein located between the capillaries in the walls of the small intestines and the hepatic sinusoids in the liver. Hepatic sinusoids is another type of capillary. Okay, so portal means it's connecting 2 capillary beds. All right. So as I said, there are 6 main hormones produced by the anterior pituitary. Plus, there's actually another one. There's actually a 7th hormone that's actually produced by a small area of tissue. It's actually part of the anterior pituitary, but it's kind of right in between the anterior pituitary and posterior pituitary. But let's look at the 6 main ones first. There are 2 hormones released by the anterior pituitary under the influence of gonadotropin-releasing hormone that's produced by the hypothalamus that regulate reproduction in both males and females. Now, they do function in both males and females. However, these 2 hormones are named after the function in women. Okay? Names of them are follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Follicle-stimulating hormones in women stimulate the growth of follicles in the ovary. Follicle is a structure which contains an oocyte, which matures into a human egg. Okay? So in other words, follicle-stimulating hormone stimulates the maturation of the egg in the follicle, which is a small compartment in the ovary. Luteinizing hormone stimulates ovulation in the female. That's the release of the egg from the follicle, about the midpoint of the reproductive cycle. And it then stimulates that empty follicle to turn into a corpus luteum, which begins secreting progesterone. Okay? So, luteinizing hormone secretes progesterone, and FSH also stimulates the production of estrogen. Okay. Now, in the male, follicle-stimulating hormone has a similar role to what it does in the female. In the male, FSH stimulates the production of sperm cells, just as FSH stimulates the growth of the follicle containing the oocyte. And luteinizing hormone in the male stimulates testosterone synthesis, just as it stimulates a hormone in the female. Okay. All right. Then a 3rd hormone produced by the anterior pituitary is thyroid-stimulating hormone. It does just what its name suggests. Thyroid-stimulating hormone promotes the maintenance of the thyroid gland as well as thyroxine synthesis by this thyroxine release and synthesis by the thyroid gland. Thyroxine is a hormone that affects nearly all the cells of the body. And what it does is it increases the basic metabolic rate of tissues. It kind of revs up our cells so that it just increases all of their activity. And that's stimulated by thyroid-stimulating hormone. So, one condition that affects individuals every once in a while is called hypothyroidism. That's when the thyroid gland is not releasing enough thyroxine or thyroid hormone. And that could cause you to be tired all the time. It can cause you to be lethargic. You have a low metabolism rate. People can tend to gain weight because their body's not burning enough of the food that they eat. And when they test for hypothyroidism, they don't just test for the thyroxine concentrations in their blood. They actually test for both thyroxine as well as thyroid stimulating hormone, because the problem could be insufficient thyroid stimulating hormone or thyroxine production. Could be either one. And so in order to effectively treat it, they need to know which of those hormones is insufficient. If TSH is insufficient, well, either way, it can be treated using Synthyroid, which is it's a synthetic form of thyroxine. But they do usually test for both TSH and thyroxine. Then a fourth anterior pituitary hormone is called adrenocorticotropic hormone. Adrenocorticotropic refers to the adrenal cortex, which is the outer layer of tissue in the adrenal glands. Adrenocorticotropic hormone stimulates the adrenal cortex to secrete glucocorticoids. Glucocorticoids are hormones that affect blood glucose levels. Also stimulates the breakdown of lipids or fatty acids, and that provides more nutrients for ATP production. And then a fifth hormone is prolactin. Prolactin is mainly secreted around the time of birth of a child, and it stimulates the mammary glands to produce milk. In males, it enhances secretion of testosterone by the testes. There's also another hormone that's involved in lactation, which is the milk production by the female after birth, and that's oxytocin, which we'll be talking about a little bit later. Oxytocin produces what's called the letdown reflex. That's the release of milk, and that's oxytocin is produced in response to suckling or nursing. And then finally, the sixth major hormone produced by the anterior pituitary is growth hormone. Growth hormone stimulates mitosis, which is cell division, and also cellular differentiation. And growth hormone is released by the anterior pituitary primarily during embryological development and childhood. Once a person matures at puberty, growth hormone secretion decreases significantly, and that's about the point when your epiphyseal plates become ossified and you no longer will grow any taller. If growth hormone continues after those epiphyseal plates become ossified, then what does that cause? We talked about it, I think, either Monday or, well, I think we talked about it Monday. It's kind of related to pituitary gigantism. Anybody remember? Okay, well, you better look it up, okay? You might need to know that on the exam. Right? Should be in that last set of PowerPoint presentations. Okay. Now, as it turns out, the endocrine glands actually provide feedback to the pituitary gland, especially the anterior pituitary. So, for example, the hypothalamus releases thyrotropin-releasing hormone, which causes the anterior pituitary to produce thyroid-stimulating hormone. Thyroid-stimulating hormone circulates through the blood. When it gets to the thyroid gland, that stimulates the production and release of thyroxine, or thyroid hormone. And thyroid hormone causes an increase in metabolism. In addition, the release of thyroid hormone also has a negative feedback effect on both the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus. That ensures that thyroid hormone levels don't get too high. Because if thyroid levels get too high, your metabolic rate would be too fast, and that would cause hyperthyroidism. Okay? And most all of the hormones produced by the endocrine glands have a negative feedback effect on the pituitary as well as the hypothalamus. And that regulates the amount of hormone. Now, in addition, there is a hormone that's barely mentioned in your textbook. It's not even mentioned in chapter 17, although it is produced by a part of the anterior pituitary, and it is a hormone. There's another hormone called melanocyte-stimulating hormone that's produced by a part of the pituitary gland that's kind of in between the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary, although it's now considered to be part of the anterior pituitary. And it's called, that area right there in the middle, it's called the pars intermedia, which is actually, as I said, it's part of the anterior pituitary. Now, that little sliver of tissue, which is very, very small in adults, produces a form of melanocyte-stimulating hormone. There's different forms of the hormone produced by different cells in the body. But the form that's produced by the pars intermedia is called alpha melanocyte-stimulating hormone. One of the things that melanocyte-stimulating hormone does is it stimulates melanocytes in the skin to release melanin. Melanin is a dark pigment that causes tanning, or produces dark pigment in your skin. And that is thought to help protect our skin from the effects of ultraviolet light. So our skin cells produce some melanocyte-stimulating hormone when they're exposed to ultraviolet light. In addition, this pars intermedia produces a form of melanocyte-stimulating hormone called alpha melanocyte-stimulating hormone. That's thought to play a role in the suppression of appetite. So it helps to control hunger. Okay. But it's not a major hormone. There's not a whole lot known about it as far as the melanocyte-stimulating hormone produced by the pituitary. And probably because of that, it's not even mentioned in chapter 17. It is mentioned in the chapter on the skin, but it's only mentioned with respect to stimulating the release of melanin by the melanocytes. All right, then there's the two hormones released by the posterior pituitary, and I want to emphasize release because remember, these two hormones are actually synthesized by the hypothalamus. So the first one is antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. It also goes by the name of vasopressin. ADH stimulates the reabsorption of water by the kidneys. So it causes you to retain water. Okay? And ADH is released in response to increases in the osmolarity of body fluids. So if you get dehydrated, there's actually osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus, and those osmoreceptors monitor your osmolarity of your body fluids. If your osmolarity gets too high, then the osmoreceptors release antidiuretic hormone, which circulates through the bloodstream, and that stimulates the reabsorption of water by the kidneys. Okay? And then the other hormone is oxytocin. Oxytocin is stimulated during childbirth in response to stretching of the cervix during delivery of the baby, and that has a positive feedback effect on the contractions of the smooth muscle in the walls of the uterus, and that's what causes labor. And oxytocin is also released during sexual arousal and also during nursing. Nursing stimulates the release of oxytocin. That causes the letdown reflex that causes milk to be released when the baby's nursing. Okay? And that oxytocin that's released when the baby's nursing also stimulates smooth muscle contraction. Okay? And that's the reason why if a mother gives birth naturally, the nurses usually encourage her to start nursing the baby right away, immediately. And the reason for that is it's not that the baby needs the milk right away, not immediately, but the reason is that nursing stimulates oxytocin release. Oxytocin stimulates smooth muscle contraction, which causes the smooth muscle in the walls of the uterus, which were, uterus was stretched quite a bit by the fetus, but after it's born, that oxytocin helps the walls of the uterus to contract and shrink down. And that also reduces the chance of hemorrhaging, because hemorrhaging can be a side effect of childbirth. And it's one of the reasons for mortality in women that have given birth. So another reason it's good for babies to nurse right away is the first milk that's produced has lots of antibodies. It's called colostrum milk. Farmers know that. They know that if you have an orphan calf, you want to try to get another cow that has recently given birth to nurse it so that it can get some of that colostrum milk. If they don't get that, they're a lot more susceptible to disease and getting things like diarrhea. So this just kind of shows how we've seen this before. I gave this to you last semester, towards the beginning of the semester actually, as an example of a positive feedback cycle. And so when a woman gets close to the end of gestation, which is about 9 months, the baby's head usually starts pushing down on the cervix, which is right here, and there are stretch receptors in the walls of the cervix. So when the baby's head start pushing down, that stimulates those stretch receptors, and that stimulates the release of oxytocin from the posterior pituitary. The oxytocin then is released into the bloodstream, circulates through the blood, and that causes contractions of the smooth muscles in the wall of the uterus. Those contractions push the baby's head down onto the cervix even more, causing more stretching. The more stretching, the more oxytocin is released. And so the contractions keep getting stronger and stronger until the cervix is dilated enough that the baby can be pushed out and delivered. Okay? Once the baby is delivered, that positive feedback cycle is interrupted. And so oxytocin secretion decreases until the baby starts nursing. So that's That's usually the case for most positive feedback cycles. They're not very common. Most of the time when a positive feedback cycle occurs, it's a result of a failure of one of our control systems to maintain homeostasis. Generally, you want physiological variables to remain relatively constant, and positive feedback does just the opposite. It causes a variable to move further and further away from the norm, and that's usually undesirable because our body usually works best under nearly constant conditions. All right. Any questions? All right, well, let's do a couple of review questions. Okay. It says, which hormone would be best to treat a patient with acromegaly? This was the disorder that I was referring to earlier. Okay. Acromegaly is when growth hormone is released after a person's epiphyseal plates have become fused, usually as an adult. Big mixed bag here. Okay. So if a person has acromegaly, that's when an adult produces too much growth hormone. Okay. Normally, there's not much growth hormone at all produced during an adult. And so what you would want to administer to them would be somatostatin, because that inhibits the release of growth hormone. Okay. That was a tough question. Okay, this is an easier one. How many hormones are synthesized by the posterior pituitary? Now be careful on this one. This could be a trick question. I'll just come right out and say, this is a trick question. Okay. Notice I didn't say released by the posterior pituitary. It said synthesized. Okay, let's take a look. Most of you said 2. Let's see what the correct answer is. The correct answer is 0. Why is that? Anybody know? Remember, the hormones released by the posterior pituitary are actually synthesized in the cell bodies of neurons up in the hypothalamus. So it doesn't produce any. But ADH and oxytocin are released from the posterior pituitary, but they're not synthesized there. Okay, that's kind of a trick question. There are two hormones that are released by the posterior pituitary, but they're actually produced by the hypothalamus. So, okay, well that's all I have for you for today. Well, let me just give you some clues. I threw a lot of information at you today, so mainly I want you to understand how the hypothalamus communicates with the anterior pituitary and how it communicates with the posterior pituitary. You don't need to know the names of any of the releasing hormones produced by the hypothalamus. I do want you to know the 6 main hormones produced by the anterior pituitary and the 2 hormones produced by the posterior pituitary. Okay. I probably won't ask anything about melanocyte stimulating hormone because it's not even mentioned in chapter 17. Okay. So that's just some bonus material I threw in there. So, and then I guess it's probably good to kind of understand how there's negative feedback from the endocrine glands to the hypothalamus and pituitary. That's how the levels of hormones are regulated, so the levels don't get too high. All right. So we'll do some more review questions then on Friday, okay, before our first exam.